On a deserted stretch of highway, retired Army general pulls over for a quiet morning drive. But his peace shatters when flashing red and blue lights appear in his rearview mirror. A routine stop quickly escalates as a suspicious officer fixates on the heavy steel safe in his back seat. Demands turn into threats, and authority becomes intimidation. Calm, composed, and unshaken, he refuses to back down. What the officer doesn't know is that he has faced far greater battles, and this time, the fight is about to leave a mark they'll never forget. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long golden streaks across the two-lane highway that cut through the outskirts of Windham, Georgia. The road was nearly empty, save for Marcus Hayes' black SUV cruising steadily along the asphalt. The hum of the tires and the faint rhythm of jazz playing through the speakers filled the cabin, creating a rare sense of calm. Marcus, a tall, broad-shouldered black man with streaks of gray at his temples, kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting casually on the armrest. His crisp, tailored suit and polished shoes hinted at a man who valued discipline and order. Even now, after years of retirement from the U.S. Army, Marcus carried himself like the general he once was, calm, measured, and exuding an unspoken authority. In the back seat, a large steel safe sat strapped securely, its surface smooth and impenetrable. To Marcus, it wasn't just a container. It was a vault of memories and legacies, military service medals, personal documents, and heirlooms passed down through generations. What others might see as a cold, metallic box, Marcus saw as a symbol of his hard-earned achievements and the sacrifices that came with them. The safe wasn't just locked. It was fortified. Marcus had insisted on installing a built-in security mechanism, an indelible paint defense system designed to mark anyone who dared to tamper with it. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation, something that decades in the military had ingrained in him. Marcus shifted in his seat, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror as the distant shimmer of blue and red lights broke the tranquility of the morning. A police cruiser was closing in fast, and within seconds, the siren pierced through the air. Of course, Marcus muttered under his breath, signaling and pulling over to the shoulder. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't changed lanes abruptly or rolled through a stop sign. Yet here he was, watching the patrol car ease to a halt behind him. As Marcus lowered his window, he straightened his posture. Years of leadership had taught him the importance of appearances, even in situations like this. He didn't fumble for his ID or reach for the glove box. Instead, he rested his hands on the wheel, keeping them in plain sight. The officer approached with deliberate steps, boots crunching against gravel. He was a stocky man with a square jaw and closely cropped hair. His uniform was sharp, but the way he carried himself, the tightness in his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his holster suggested something less stable beneath the surface. "Morning, sir," the officer said, his voice clipped and authoritative. The name tag on his chest read Redding. "Morning, officer." Marcus kept his tone even, his eyes locked on Redding's. "License and registration, please." Marcus complied, pulling the documents from his glove box and handing them over. As Redding flipped through them, his gaze shifted toward the back seat, where the safe gleamed under the sunlight filtering through the window. "What's in the safe?" Redding asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Personal items, documents." Redding's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's an unusual place to keep something like that, don't you think?" Marcus let out a slow breath, already sensing where this was heading. "I don't see how that's relevant, officer." Redding leaned closer, his shadow falling across Marcus. "Unusual can be suspicious. So, I'm going to need you to open it up for me." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "Respectfully, no. Unless you have probable cause, I'm not obligated to open anything." The shift in Redding's demeanor was almost instant. The faint smirk that had played on his lips hardened into a scowl. His shoulders squared, and his voice dropped an octave. "You sure about that?" Marcus met his glare without flinching. "I know my rights." For a brief moment, silence hung between them, heavy and crackling with tension. Redding took a step back, his hand resting on his belt. "Wait here," he said before turning on his heel and striding back toward his patrol car. Marcus's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he watched Redding retreat. He had dealt with men like this before, men who mistook authority for power, who saw every challenge as an affront to their ego. Marcus had faced far greater threats in his lifetime, but something about this moment felt different. His phone sat in the cup holder beside him. With a quick swipe, he opened the camera app and set it to record. He didn't want trouble, but he wasn't about to let himself be railroaded either. Redding returned moments later, but this time he wasn't empty-handed. A crowbar hung loosely in one hand as he approached the SUV, his stride brimming with purpose. Marcus stepped out of the car, his height forcing Redding to look up slightly. "You don't want to do this," Marcus warned, his voice steady but edged with authority. "Oh, I think I do," Redding shot back. "You're acting suspicious, and I have a job to do." Marcus shook his head, his expression unyielding. "This is private property. Tampering with it without cause is unlawful." Redding smirked, tapping the crowbar against his palm. "We'll see about that." Marcus didn't move as Redding turned toward the back door, crowbar in hand. The faint hiss of compressed air was barely audible before it happened. A burst of bright green paint erupted from the safe, spraying Redding from head to toe. The safe wasn't just locked. It was fortified. Marcus had insisted on installing a built-in security mechanism, an indelible paint defense system designed to mark anyone who dared to tamper with it. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation, something that decades in the military had ingrained in him. The sergeant stumbled back, dropping the crowbar as he wiped at his face. "What the—" Marcus fought back a smirk, but the corners of his mouth betrayed him. "I warned you," he said, crossing his arms as Redding flailed in place, smearing the paint further. Marcus stood with the calm poise of a man who had faced chaos before and come out on top. Across from him, Sergeant Redding was anything but composed. His uniform was streaked with fluorescent green paint, dripping down his chest and arms like melting neon wax. His face was blotched with splashes of the same color, making him look more like a traffic cone than a man of authority. The sergeant's chest heaved as he glared at Marcus, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. He swiped at his face again, but the industrial-grade paint only smeared further, adding to the ridiculousness of his appearance. "You think this is funny?" Redding barked, his voice strained. Marcus raised an eyebrow, holding up his phone so the red recording light was visible. "I think it's documented." The words hung in the air, cold and deliberate. Redding froze for a beat, his eyes flicking to the phone. He knew exactly what that meant. No amount of bluster could undo what had just happened, not when it was captured on video. But rather than backing down, Redding doubled down. "This is obstruction of justice," he shouted, pointing a dripping green finger at Marcus. "You assaulted an officer." Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, planting his feet like a man prepared to stand his ground. "No, Sergeant. This is you violating my rights and tampering with my property. The safe. That's called security, legal security, by the way. And the recording. That's insurance." Redding's face twisted into something ugly. "I don't need a lecture from you." He took a step closer, but Marcus didn't budge. "Then maybe you need a lawyer," Marcus said smoothly, slipping his phone into his jacket pocket while keeping it aimed in Redding's direction. "Because every second you stand here looking like this, you're building my case." For the first time, Redding hesitated. The weight of the situation seemed to be sinking in, but his pride wouldn't let him back off. Instead, he turned sharply and stormed toward his patrol car, leaving a trail of green footprints in the dirt. Marcus watched him go, his military instincts already assessing the next move. Redding wasn't retreating, he was regrouping, and Marcus had no intention of letting his guard down. Sure enough, the sergeant returned moments later, this time holding a radio in one hand and a roll of paper towels in the other. He dabbed furiously at his face, but the paint refused to budge. It was designed to stick after all. "I've called for backup," Redding snapped, glaring at Marcus as though he'd already decided the retired general was guilty of something, anything. "We'll see how funny you think this is when they get here." Marcus leaned back against his SUV, folding his arms. "Good. Maybe they'll bring some common sense with them." Redding's face darkened, but before he could respond, the distant rumble of another car approached. Both men turned toward the sound as a silver sedan pulled onto the shoulder. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Darnell Brown, a young black man in jeans and a hoodie, his phone already raised as he recorded the scene unfolding before him. "You need help, sir," Darnell called out to Marcus, his tone loud enough to carry over the low hum of the nearby highway. Redding stiffened. "This doesn't concern you," he snapped. Darnell ignored him, walking closer while keeping his phone steady. "Looks like it does," he said, nodding toward the sergeant's paint-covered uniform. "Mind explaining why you're harassing this man?" Redding's eyes flared. "Put that phone away now." "No thanks," Darnell shot back. "You don't control me, officer. But it looks like you lost control of yourself." Marcus couldn't help but smile at the younger man's boldness. He recognized the fire in Darnell's voice, righteous anger sharpened by years of witnessing injustice. "You okay, sir?" Darnell asked, his focus shifting briefly to Marcus. "I'm fine," Marcus replied. "Just dealing with a misunderstanding that's gotten messy." Darnell chuckled, panning his camera to capture the streaks of green paint still clinging to Redding. "Looks like more than a misunderstanding. Looks like someone's having a bad day." Redding's frustration boiled over. "Enough," he shouted, reaching for his radio again. "I'll have you both arrested for obstruction." Marcus straightened, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You'll do no such thing, Sergeant. I suggest you think carefully about your next move. Because right now, all anyone sees is a man abusing his authority and making a fool of himself while he's at it." The words landed hard, and for the first time Redding faltered. His eyes darted between Marcus and Darnell, the weight of their combined presence pressing down on him. The situation had shifted completely. The officer who once seemed so sure of his power now looked like a man barely holding onto control. The sound of another car approaching only added to his unease. As a second patrol car rolled up, Marcus stood tall, ready for whatever came next. He could see the uncertainty in Redding's eyes. The sergeant had crossed a line, and now the consequences were coming fast. Darnell kept his phone steady, capturing every moment. The video wasn't just evidence, it was a shield, protecting Marcus from the very system that was supposed to serve and protect. And as the new officer stepped out of the car, Marcus couldn't help but feel the tide turning. This wasn't just a roadside encounter anymore. It was a test, a battle of principles, and Marcus wasn't about to lose. Marcus didn't move as the second patrol car came to a stop, the flashing lights reflecting off his SUV. His posture remained steady, shoulders squared, and eyes locked on Redding, who still looked like he had stepped out of a paint factory explosion. The younger officer who stepped out of the new cruiser had a far more composed demeanor. His name tag read Officer Caleb Myers, and he looked to be in his early 30s, with sharp eyes and a clean uniform that suggested he was relatively new to the force, or at least still trying to make an impression. "Sergeant Redding." Officer Myers called out, his gaze shifting from the neon green mess to the two men standing near the SUV. He took in the scene quickly: Marcus, calm and collected, and Darnell, still recording from a safe distance. "What exactly is going on here?" Redding, clearly flustered, turned to Myers, attempting to reassert himself. This man, he jabbed a paint-smeared finger toward Marcus, was behaving suspiciously, transporting a large safe in his vehicle. When I attempted to inspect it for safety reasons, the device exploded, coating me in this substance. Myers blinked, struggling to suppress what looked like a smirk. "Exploded." "It's paint," Redding barked. "It's some kind of booby trap. This man deliberately set it up to." Marcus interrupted with his usual calm authority. "Officer Myers, I'm Marcus Hayes, retired U.S. Army General." He let the weight of his title sink in for a moment before continuing. "This is my property. The safe contains personal items, including military records and heirlooms. It's equipped with a legal anti-tampering system to prevent theft. Sergeant Redding here decided to ignore my warnings, broke into it without cause, and set it off." Myers' eyes widened slightly as he registered the name. Recognition flickered across his face, and his tone shifted immediately. "General Hayes," he said respectfully, straightening his posture. "Sir, if you don't mind, I'd like to take a closer look at your identification and the documents related to the safe." Marcus gave a curt nod, stepping back toward his SUV. He retrieved his ID, along with the laminated paperwork proving the legality of the safe security system. He handed them to Myers, who examined them carefully. Meanwhile, Redding fumed, pacing like a caged animal. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "He's making this out to be my fault. I had reasonable suspicion." No, Sergeant, Marcus said firmly, his voice steady but sharp. What you had was a bias, and you acted on it without justification. Darnell's camera was still rolling, capturing every word. Myers looked up from the documents and then back at Marcus. Everything checks out, he said, his voice neutral but firm. The security system on the safe is legal, and there's no evidence that General Hayes has committed any crime. You're taking his side, Redding spat. No, Myers said pointedly, his gaze hardening. I'm taking the side of the law. The words hit Redding like a slap. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed to realize just how precarious his position had become. He glanced nervously at Darnell, whose camera was still trained on him, and then back to Marcus, who stood like a stone pillar. This isn't over, Redding muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Oh, it is, Marcus countered, his tone final. Because this, he gestured to the paint, the patrol cars, and the camera still recording isn't going away. The sound of distant sirens echoed in the air. More officers were on their way. The incident was quickly spiraling beyond Redding's control, and he knew it. Officer Myers cleared his throat. Sergeant, I need you to step aside while we take statements and sort this out. We'll also need to secure the footage Mr. Brown has captured for evidence. What? Redding snapped. You heard me. Myers' tone left no room for argument. Until we determine the full details of this incident, you're relieved of duty. Redding's face turned beet red, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he stormed back to his patrol car, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Marcus exhaled slowly, but his guard didn't drop. He knew this wasn't over, not yet. Darnell stepped closer, lowering his phone slightly but keeping it recording. Man, that was intense, he said, shaking his head. I can't believe he thought he could just get away with that. He thought he could, Marcus replied. But people like him are counting on silence, on fear. He looked at Darnell. You did good by recording this. That's how you fight back. Darnell grinned. You think this'll blow up online? Oh, it'll blow up, Marcus said. And it'll make sure this isn't swept under the rug. By the time the additional officers arrived, the scene had shifted. Marcus gave his statement with the clarity of a man who had nothing to hide, while Redding sat seething in his patrol car, waiting for the inevitable fallout. And as Marcus watched the officers take control, he knew one thing for certain: this battle was only the beginning of something much bigger. The tension in the air hung heavy as more patrol cars arrived, their lights flashing in rhythmic pulses of red and blue. Officers stepped out, their faces tight with professionalism, but tinged with curiosity, as they took in the bizarre sight: Sergeant Redding pacing near his car, drenched in neon green paint, and Marcus Hayes standing tall and composed by his SOV. Officer Caleb Myers, now fully in charge of the situation, motioned for Marcus to remain by his vehicle while he approached the senior officers. Meanwhile, Redding kept wiping at his face, smearing the paint further, his frustration boiling over. One of the arriving officers, Lieutenant Frank Collins, an older black man with graying hair and sharp eyes, stepped out of his car. He was known throughout the department as fair, but no nonsense, and his presence immediately shifted the energy at the scene. Sergeant Redding, Collins said, his tone carrying the weight of authority, what in the hell am I looking at? Redding, still seething, pointed at Marcus. This man set me up. He had some kind of booby trap in his car, a security system that attacked me with paint. Collins raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. A security system attacked you? Yes, Redding snapped, gesturing at the streaks of green. He refused to cooperate, and I had probable cause to inspect the safe he was transporting. When I tried to open it, this happened. Collins turned toward Marcus, giving him a quick once-over before speaking. And you are? Marcus stepped forward, his shoulders squared and his voice steady. Marcus Hayes. Retired U.S. Army General. This is my property, Lieutenant. He handed over his ID and the laminated security documents, which Myers had already verified earlier. Collins studied the papers briefly, then looked back up at Marcus. And you're telling me this was a legally installed anti-tampering system? Yes, sir, Marcus replied. And Sergeant Redding activated it after ignoring multiple warnings to step away. Collins exhaled, already piecing the story together. You warned him. Several times. Collins turned to Myers. And you confirmed this? Yes, sir, Myers said. General Hayes' documents are in order. And Mr. Brown, he gestured toward Darnell, still holding his phone, recorded the entire incident. From what I've seen so far, the sergeant acted without justification. Redding's face turned red. You're taking his side. I'm taking the side of the law, Collins shot back sharply, echoing Myers' earlier words. Which is something you should have been doing instead of playing cowboy. The other officers shifted uneasily, clearly uncomfortable as the scene unfolded. Collins gestured to one of them. Take Sergeant Redding's statement and then escort him back to the station. I want him off duty until further notice. You can't be serious, Redding barked. I'm dead serious, Collins replied, stepping closer until he was nose to nose with the sergeant. You want to talk about probable cause? Fine. We'll talk about it in my office, with internal affairs sitting across from you. Redding's mouth opened, but no words came out. Instead, he stomped back to his car, slamming the door and leaving streaks of green paint on the handle. Collins turned back to Marcus. General Hayes, I want to personally apologize for what happened here today. This should never have escalated the way it did. I appreciate that, Lieutenant, Marcus said, though his tone was guarded. But an apology doesn't fix the larger problem. This isn't just about one officer stepping out of line, it's about the culture that allows it to happen in the first place. Collins nodded slowly, clearly aware of the truth in those words. I understand. And I won't pretend this incident won't have consequences for all of us. Marcus folded his arms. I'm going to make sure of that. At that moment, Darnell stepped forward. Lieutenant, I've got the whole thing on video. Do you want me to send it to someone specific? Collins hesitated, but Marcus spoke first. Send it to me. I'll make sure it gets to the right people. Darnell nodded, tapping his phone. Already uploaded, General. I'll forward the link. Collins turned to Darnell. You might want to prepare for some attention. Videos like this have a way of spreading. That's the point, Darnell replied with a grin. Marcus looked at the young man with a nod of respect. You did good today. People need to see this. Collins cleared his throat. We'll finish processing everything at the station and file the appropriate reports. General Hayes, if you'd like to come by later, we'll make sure you're kept updated. Marcus nodded, shaking Collins' hand. I'll be there. As the crowd began to disperse and the patrol cars pulled away, Marcus stood by his SUV, watching the tail lights disappear down the road. Darnell lingered for a moment, still buzzing with adrenaline. You think this'll make a difference? He asked. Marcus looked down the road, his expression thoughtful. It's a start, he said, but the fight's far from over. Darnell grinned. Guess I'll see you in the headlines then. Marcus chuckled softly. You just might? As Darnell walked away, Marcus climbed back into his SUV, the weight of the morning still pressing on his shoulders, but tempered by the knowledge that this wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a much larger battle. And this time, the world would be watching. The morning after the incident, Marcus Hayes woke up to a flood of notifications on his phone. News outlets, social media platforms, and advocacy groups had picked up the video Darnell Brown had uploaded. The footage of Sergeant Redding drenched in neon green paint, yelling accusations while Marcus calmly stood his ground, had gone viral overnight. Headlines ranged from "Retired General Stands Tall Against Police Misconduct" to "Painted Justice, a Lesson in Accountability." Marcus sat at his kitchen table, sipping black coffee, as he scrolled through the endless stream of comments and messages. Some praised his composure, calling him an inspiration. Others vented their outrage, demanding reform and justice. And then there were the critics, downplaying the incident, defending the officer, and accusing Marcus of overreacting. He expected that. It was the nature of these situations. His daughter, Maya, called early. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. "I'm fine," Marcus assured her. "You saw the video." "Of course I saw it. The whole country saw it." She paused. "You handled it well, but what now? What's the next move?" Marcus stared out the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'm heading to the station. This isn't over." When Marcus arrived at the Windham Police Department, the mood was tense. Officers avoided eye contact as he walked through the lobby, his polished shoes echoing off the tiled floor. He was led to Lieutenant Collins' office, where Collins sat waiting with a stack of paperwork and a solemn expression. "General Hayes," Collins greeted, standing and extending his hand. Marcus shook it firmly. "Lieutenant," Marcus replied, sitting across the desk. Collins slid a folder toward him. "We've launched an internal investigation into Sergeant Redding's actions. For now, he's been suspended without pay. Based on the video evidence and your statement, the case is strong, but this process will take time." Marcus flipped through the documents, nodding. Time is fine as long as it leads to accountability. But this can't stop with Redding. What happened yesterday wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a larger pattern. Collins leaned back, rubbing his temples. "I don't disagree. We've been struggling to change things around here, but incidents like this," he trailed off, "they set us back." Marcus leaned forward. "Then don't let it. Use this as the push to do better. New training protocols, oversight committees, whatever it takes. But it has to start now." Collins studied him for a moment before nodding. "I'll bring it up with the chief, but we're going to need your voice to keep the pressure on." "You'll have it," Marcus said without hesitation. Within days, the story had become a national conversation. News anchors dissected every moment of the video, civil rights activists called for reforms, and social media users demanded justice. Sergeant Redding's history of complaints began surfacing. Allegations of profiling, excessive force, and intimidation tactics all swept under the rug until now. Redding himself tried to defend his actions in a televised interview, claiming he'd been set up and provoked. But the damage was already done. The paint-covered image of him had become a meme, and no amount of deflection could erase the public humiliation. The Windham Police Department responded with swift damage control. Redding's suspension turned into termination after the investigation concluded that he had violated multiple policies. He was stripped of his badge and faced civil lawsuits, including one from Marcus for unlawful detainment and emotional distress. Marcus, meanwhile, became a reluctant public figure. Invitations poured in for interviews, panel discussions, and community meetings. He accepted a few, not to seek fame, but to make sure the conversation didn't lose momentum. 1 month after the incident, Marcus stood in front of a packed town hall meeting. The crowd was diverse locals, activists, and supporters from neighboring towns who had come to hear him speak. Darnell sat in the front row, his phone at the ready, streaming the event live. Marcus adjusted the microphone and looked out at the audience. "I didn't plan to be here," he began. "That morning, I was just a man driving through town with his belongings locked safely in the back seat. But in a matter of minutes, I became something else, a suspect, a target, a problem to be handled." He paused, letting the words settle. What happened that day isn't unique. It's a reflection of a system that too often judges by appearance instead of character. But here's the thing: change doesn't happen by accident. It happens when we stand up, speak out, and demand better. The crowd erupted in applause. Marcus raised a hand, signaling for quiet. "This isn't just about me or Sergeant Redding. It's about all of us, about what kind of world we want to live in. And I'm here to tell you that we don't have to settle for what's broken. We can fix this. But it's going to take more than words. It's going to take action." Over the next few months, the town of Windham implemented significant reforms. Community advisory boards were formed to oversee the police department. Officers underwent new bias and de-escalation training, and body cameras became mandatory. Marcus remained involved, serving as an advisor to the reform committee. He worked closely with Lieutenant Collins and other local leaders to ensure the changes were more than just symbolic gestures. Darnell, inspired by the role he'd played, started a podcast focused on civil rights and accountability. His first guest? Marcus Hayes. On a crisp morning months later, Marcus was back on the highway, the same stretch where everything began. The sun painted the horizon gold as he drove, but this time there was no tension in his shoulders. His SUV hummed steadily, and the safe sat in the back seat, untouched and unbothered. He glanced in the rearview mirror, catching sight of Windham's water tower in the distance. A town that had once felt hostile now felt changed, still imperfect, but moving in the right direction. As he merged onto the open road, Marcus allowed himself a rare smile. He had faced prejudice, challenged it, and walked away stronger. And while the fight wasn't over, he knew this victory would stand as proof that change was always possible, as long as someone was willing to take the first step.